Terve, hello, welcome to Rauta's original Finnish Black Metal from the early days video series. And because we are focusing on Finnish Black Metal, I decided to go fully Finnish accent throughout the video. I hope you can manage it because I know some people don't like my accent, so this is what I'm gonna do. Joking around, obviously you wouldn't stand if I was going through that the whole video. Anyhow, this is exactly what it is. Talking about early days Finnish black metal from the 80s. Mostly focusing, however, bands founded in the 90s, but because there are a couple of bands already from the 80s, we'll start with that. Now, before we get rolling down the list, 3 bands per episode, this is quite much related to the series which I did about Norwegian black metal from the 90s, which I started already about 18 months before doing this series, and which ended only this year, 2024. And because people were hoping for me to do a similar series about Finnish black metal, it's time to do it. So 3 bands per episode, and because of certain bands have so much music, especially throughout the discography, it might take some time for me to finish episode after episode, including 3 bands per one. So might take time to release the part 2 as well. But first we'll tackle the first 3 essential bands from the Finnish black metal underground, namely Beherit Archgoat Impaled Nazarene. Welcome to the show. So we'll start with Beherit. Before we get all that, something needs to be addressed. Now, all of these bands are obviously not that underground anymore. That is partially given their age. I mean, when you have something like 35 years in the history, of course you have made an impact, even if some of these bands had a little bit of a break here and there in terms of creating music. But when you have history, enough history, which makes the footprint in the scene last forever and forever, means that, you know, those social media numbers and listening times through the last FM or whatever streaming service you're using, they're gonna climb up. Meaning that while these are not the most active bands in terms of, you know, live, I mean, some of them are now doing more than ever these live presentations, shows, gigs, tours, what have you, but that wasn't the case always. So it's kind of curious to see that these bands I'm presenting here are actually both some of the most recognized and most followed bands from the Finnish underground, even if they were not really that much touring. I mean, when you compare the certain numbers, be it social media following, Facebook, Instagram, whatever you have there, or Last FM listening amounts to, say, Norwegian black metal bands, some of these might feel a little bit small, but compared to a lot of other bands coming from Finland, these are exactly quite big. A lot bigger than I would anticipate for some of these. Anyhow, these are just numbers, but numbers do have a meaning, no matter what your opinion is. You can't deny certain facts. And numbers tell you a lot about how much certain bands have been, you know, people have been listening to. And it's not something you cannot really fake. You can fake a lot of things. You can make your own opinions about certain, like whether this band is black metal enough or it's given topics or music or whatever. These are debatable, but numbers, not so much. So whatever you think, certain things don't really matter what you think. You go with the numbers. You don't have to like them, but you have to understand it is what it is. So, first of all, we go to Beherit, one of the most recognized, most respected, but also one of the weirdest black metal comes ever to come from Finland. Why weird? That could be answered in so many ways, but I'll come from a musical perspective and say because it wasn't black metal all the way through, and also because their music has always been, even in terms of black metal, quite challenging. There are lots of people who are like, Beherit is just too weird for me. It's too raw for me. It's too, I don't know, out of ordinary. There are these people even in the extreme metal scene. I never was really that big of a Beherit fan. I wouldn't really call myself a Beherit fan, even though I, of course, recognize and respect whatever they have done. I mean, all my respect really, really goes deep because these guys were one of the starting points in Finland when it comes to black metal. And when they were doing their stuff, lot of those bigger bands, which you might find in Norway or other places, didn't even exist. We're talking about the late 80s. And even if we were talking about 1990 or so, there were lots of bands that didn't have anything out there yet. So even if you don't like the music, you got to understand, without Beherit, things would be quite different in many places in the world, not just in Finland, because there are even people in Norway like, hey, Beherit made a big impact for me and that's what I wanted to do and blah, blah, blah. But we're not going to focus on so much about how the bands have impacted other things or other bands, because that really needs to be gone through the different bands and goes beyond the scope of this video. But what we can do is give a little bit of a oversight, like what is this band all about, how the things have changed, and what has happened throughout the years and so on. So more like a stepping stone, an entry-level intro to world of Beherit. My full scope in terms of Beherit's music, discography, lyrics, and all that stuff is linked to this video in the end of this video. So that goes a little bit deeper. And now we just go quickly through whatever happened throughout the years and how the music has changed. That will be more deeper, so otherwise this would be 2 hours a video, and you will understand why. So let's go to Rovaniemi, Lappi. Very, very much north in Finland. One could even make the claim that back in the days this was probably the most northern black metal band on earth. At least one of the very fucking least few bands, because, Lappi is a big region in terms of Finland. And Finland is like a very long country from the southern parts to Finland. It's more than, it's almost 1,000 miles. It's something like 1,300 kilometers and more, which means when you go from south, like Helsinki, Turku, whatever, to northern parts of Finland, it takes hours and hours because it's so far away. So Rovaniemi, what we often called as the central point of Lapland, Lappi, is exactly very, very north. Even you can go even much northern from that, hardly there are any bigger cities. So it's kind of a even somewhat level of a miracle that you can get a black metal band from that north. It's not like the nature isn't inspiring, but more so how on earth there are people in those smaller cities, figuring out, I want to play black metal as well. Especially back in the days when black metal wasn't really a thing. When we were talking about the 80s, there were hardly more than a few bands, the Venoms, the Battery, Celtic Frost, so on, but only a few bands. Greece were starting up something. Of course, there were some bands borderlining black metal back in the days in Canada, like Blasphemy or Sarcophago from Brazil, but they were not that clearly, obviously, black metal as, say, Bathory and Celtic Frost. So when guys from the 1980s figure out we're gonna do some Finnish black metal, it's all bets are off. However, this is exactly what started, and obviously throughout different names before they finally landed with Beherit. So what started basically in the 80s, what was more like with the name Beherit since the 90s. But these are merely gaps of months. So we're not talking about years of year changing and then, being something else. If you go for Norwegian band, there are similar stories. Certain bands started, say, like in 1991, changed their name in 1993 to something else that you might know nowadays. So there are lots of these stories when bands go for first steps, like treading the water with different names and then becoming something else. So whatever happened before Beherit it doesn't really matter in the whole context. So much like everybody else, Beherit started with demos, and they had quite a few demos before Dawn of Satan's Millennium in 1991. And of course, the early years were very much inspired by these bands mentioned, like Sarcophago, Blasphemy, what have you, trading and, just being fan of, or insane level of fandom back in the days. And of course, the bands would start, releasing their music, via tape trading once again. They would play, youth houses, whatever they're called, places for kids anyway, perform, or even at the local mall. Might feel really, really weird some 35 years later to figure out, like, okay, that's what they really did. They were teenagers. They were experimenting. They were going full into the world of occult, satanic topics and all. So lots of things happen. If you take a look at these Metal Archives list, for example, for the discography, you have demos, you have EP, and more demos to come up. And it was 1993 when Drawing Down the Moon, really the first album, came out. And this was already quite different one for what, for example, happened with the Oath of Black Blood. Raw black metal may be inspired by these black trash band or black death bands like Blasphemy. So it's kind of a weird that they made their own sound so different from these bands. Lots of experimentation, even ambient parts, and raw end of black metal. Not fast pounding like the bands that probably inspired them a lot, but even slow tempo, kind of a doomier thing. So very, very unique. I mean, if you compare this to any of the, say, Swedish or Norwegian band of the time, you really can't say Beherit exactly sounds any of them. And of course, there are plenty of bands from Norway and Sweden which were more or less original during the early years, but still saying Beherit certainly, most definitely, don't sound anything like Swedes or Norwegians were doing. But of course, this is also the weird thing, like, say, bands like Marduk's or Burzums or whatever, they were figuring out and honing their black metal to a different degree and, pushing their style and all that stuff. Whereas Beherit already jumped off the wagon by the second album, H4180V21.C. Horrible name, and of course there's a story to that, but goes beyond the scope of this video. And that was going into world of ambient stuff, not the dark ambient nowadays, but then again there was already dark ambient from the 80s and early 90s, so quite a different, it's almost like a missing link between dark ambient and dungeon synth. So once again quite different from, say, whatever Mortis and the other people started doing back in the 90s. I mean, Dark Throne guys, or Fenders at least, had a Dungeon Synth project, or back in the days probably wasn't called Dungeon Synth. Satyricon had a Von Graven, and so on. And Beherit was doing something different. It wasn't really the dark ambient of, like, say, Lustmord, or whatever was happening back in the days. It wasn't certainly like Tangerine Dream. It wasn't like, say, Mortis once again, or Von Graven, whatever. It was somewhere different. And the same unique style was there. But I guess back in the days it must have been shocking to a lot of people who grew up with the Oath of the Black Blood, raw black metal, violent, bestial and all that stuff. And then doing these momentum changes with Drawing Down the Moon. And eventually moving on to Electric Doom Synthesis, which is then again, once again, a little bit different from H418. Now these are later on released as a compilation one, so you can get to listen to both with one go and all. Personally, I feel Electric Doom Synthesis is really a step up from that, but this seems to, differ from people to people. Metal Archives clearly puts the focus on Electric Doom Synthesis as on quality, but like I said, these are weird steps. Now, then Beherit was suddenly no more. Take a look at here what it says on the list here when the band was active. So it stopped around 1996 or so. And a lot of people know that when Beherit's Holocausto decided to move more into electronic music, into dance music, and becoming a DJ Gamma, was living in India, even all of the places, founding Buddhism and all that stuff. And things were changing a lot in a span of few years. And I guess all bets were off for Beherit ever doing a black metal album anymore. It was by this moment more like a cult act that did burn with a bright flame for an amount of years and then was goner, until suddenly Engram in 2009 came with full force. And in my opinion, it's the best Beherit album so far ever. It's like almost like the continuation to Oath of the Black Blood rather than Drawing Down the Moon with its very, very raw, inspired, primal black metal. A really good album, great album even. And it's weird that there is no other Ingram, not before or after. It's just like things changed. I'm going to skip the Devil Studio stuff because this is, of course, older recording, and then jump into Bardo Exist. Another 11 years later, which was then again stepping more into the world of ambient. And this album that came out last year, WBRRR, which was almost like went totally under the radar, is once again a continuation to Bardo Exist. So to summarize the whole idea is like you have the first steps of like on the verge, on the borderline of the first and second wave of black metal, the early Beherit days. Then you have the ambient phase. Then you have another dose of raw black metal phase and another ambient phase. And nowadays, Beherit is performing live, and they're quickly sold out, and people have been praising the live, whatever they started already in early 2024, now done a few shows, and there will be shows for 2025 as well. So it's been a weird fucking ride throughout the years. There are lots of compilations and lives and whatever, which are just basically recapping the older material. So this vastly looking, this big looking discography thing is a little bit misleading because a lot of things are being reissued, recycled, and all that stuff. You can probably cut it by half, and then you have roughly the real amount of Beherit stuff. Of course, in terms of albums, you want to really learn about what Beherit is all about. Maybe Messedev's Mort's EP is definitely worth giving a shot, as well as Dawn of Satan's Millennium. But in my opinion, the most fundamental parts, especially when we're talking about metal Beherit, are obviously Engram, then Droning Down the Mood, and The Oath of the Black Blood. But like I said, this is morally gone through in lyrics and cover image-wise in my Beherit discography retrospective video. But this is just a weird ride comparing to a lot of bands. You only do basically very, very little before you just abandon black metal altogether. And nowadays they're still maybe one of the most followed, most respected, and most liked black metal band coming from Finland, which is indeed quite weird considering how few black metal releases, like albums, they have in the first place. But it's truly a unique band, always have been, and this is partially which gets my respect. In one way, you could say it has more in common with, say, Norwegian names like Dødheimskard for the creativity and being unique, but then again also with bands like Burzum having basically more focused on one guy doing the music and jumping between back and forth metal and dungeons/dark ambient. So it's a weird ride, but it's a fantastic, and we're gonna see what lies ahead for Beherit in coming years. So much simpler and also nowadays more active, but in a different ways, is Archgoat, which started roughly around the same year, 1989. But it took a little bit longer for them to release a demo, Jesus Spawn, which was then again followed by more stuff like Penis Perverser or Angel Gun, the first EP. Now this is very, very early in terms of Finnish Black Metal from 1991 to 1993 and all that stuff. And Archgoat was basically coming from a same direction, roughly, from the world of where black and death metal is combined. It's there often labeled here, like the genre says, death/black metal. I guess it would be kind of fair to call them black/death metal to kind of focus, because the lyrical side and the themes and all that stuff is more black. But there are the death metal growls and all. So it's kind of fair to put them both in the same sentence. So coming from a little bit same direction from Beherit, like, you know, once again having the blasphemy and probably sarcophagus and things like that in the background, in the back of their heads, doing the music, they were gone, you know, way quicker. I mean, what started in basically with 1991 demo, it was gone after 2 years. So not much happening really until when they came back around 2004 and they came back with full force, doing shows after shows, winning people over. And these guys are from the same city. I got to know them early 2000s when they weren't really doing black metal. But it was obvious we had, you know, mutual friends and all, and probably them, you know, kind of reuniting with a lot of black metal people and metal people in the home city and other parts. Probably ignite these brothers. I mean, it was brothers plus drummer, and the drummer place has always been really windy. You know, people have been changing throughout the years. But the brothers handling vocals, bass, guitars, you know, songwriting, they have always been the core, and even more so Ritual Butcher, the guitarist and songwriter. And with him, I have done a couple of interesting interviews, and one will be out in a couple of weeks. Maybe 4 or so. But anyway, the point here is these brothers have kept the flame going on now more than 20 years since the comeback. And more than that, including, I mean, when they started 35 years. It's quite a wild ride, really. So when they came back in the early 2000s and started doing music, they were like quickly recognized like a, powerful force, powerful band that were not fucking around but delivering the combination of death and black metal. And suddenly that was followed by the debut album Whore of Bethlehem, already a strong album. And then 3 years later, Light Devouring Darkness, and then EPs, splits, what have you, older and newer material, and then again releasing a new album 6 years later, another album 3 years later, another album 3 years later. So nowadays they have been very, very active. They've been touring, they've been doing gigs, and they've been showing album after album that they are not fucking around. They were not here doing a comeback for a few years then vanishing again. In my opinion, this Archgoat version 2.0, meaning since the comeback, they have been really, really even more powerful than what they showed with the Angel Gun, which is, by the way, quite good of an EP. But the albums have been even better, so it kind of shows that the experience and understanding of the music and nothing to do with the teenager years anymore. They have been like, wow, we're gonna like really nail down your Jesus Christ, and we're gonna do powerful shows. We understand what kind of music we want to do, keep the original style of lyrics and all, and nothing really has changed in that sense. And I think it's partially because of the two brothers being united and, keeping the whole building together with like two strong pillars. One is handling the bass and the vocals with really good, strong vocals, and the one is taking care of the guitars and songwriting. So they are like, a dynamic duo. Think of, the Dark Thrones and what have you in a similar fashion. Like you have these two strong guys, really, really keeping up the flame going on, and nothing but respect these guys. I mean, I've seen them many times live and they never let you down. And what they have been doing with albums and live is just like, you don't really fake that shit. It's real stuff. And I'm really proud to have this from my home city, one of the cornerstones of Finnish Black Metal. But this is also something that I went deeper in my retrospective video, so that will be also linked here. And 2 interviews with these guys, one with Beherit, 2 with Archgoat now. So yeah, I don't know if I can manage all the links here, but you will probably figure it out. And then last but not least, we have Impaled Nazarene, roughly from the same era, 1990 and onwards. This is an interesting band also because they come from Oulu, quite north, but not as north as Beherit. And ever since they did the first demo material, it was kind of clear that these guys were paving the road for their own style. And now one thing is very, very important to understand. All these bands are very different. So when Beherit was maybe the more experimental with their raw black metal and ambient and all, and Archgoat was like, serving with the blasphemous, yet quite simplistic barbarian death and black metal, Impaled Nazarene was like the weird kid between these two. Not as weird as Beherit maybe, but also not as death metallic as, say, Archgoat. And also a little bit more, giving middle fingers and all. And that's partially because of the vocalist Mika Luttinen, who has never been, holding back, whatever provocative words he had. So first years, much like the other bands, first you do figure out some demos, some EP and whatever, and then with full force, Stall Corrupt, Nords, which is quite of a good album still these days and already, having a really strong production. But it was, in my opinion, it still is not as focused as what was the second album already the same year, Ugra Garma, which more like, okay, now we're gonna shift upper gear, we're gonna take it to a different level, and we're gonna do it more aggression, better songwriting, better focus, and all that stuff. These are quite weird album names if you really think about it. They don't sound your typical, think about Light Devouring Darkness, Whore of Bethlehem, really taking the under-religious statement, more closer to like, what the hell is Drawing Down the Moon? Kind of weird names. And then it went all Finnish, Suomi, Finland, Perkele, which was suddenly like a middle finger towards our enemies, be it Russia, probably Sweden too, more focusing like we come from Finland, we don't bow, we don't give a fuck about other countries and all that stuff. So not so much nationalistic, but more like patriotic in a sense, like we're coming from Finland and if you don't like it, fuck you. Yeah, lots of fucking around and all that stuff, but there was no holding back. And it was quite interesting album with, rock and roll grooviness, but also the black metal early days mentality and the kind of a punkishness, which is very, very much present there, but way more metallic. So maybe it doesn't really come as a surprise that when from Suomi-Finland Perkele, they went more into the punkier and also motorheadic directions with albums like Latex Cult and Rapture. These are almost like going hardcore punk in a way, blending together with black metal. So they have been like changing their style album after album already in the early days. Like within first 10 years, the band was constantly shifting, yet having still the very much Impaled Nazarene style intact. Nihil suddenly becomes way more darker. This is also the phase where it started kind of getting more melodic. One of my favorite albums by Impaled Nazarene, I'm not gonna deny that, because it's actually, like the album says, nihil, kind of a nihilistic. There's certain like kind of a darker feeling and less of these like middle fingering punky aggression like with Latex Cult and Rapture. But for me, the darkness works better. So then they moved on to 2000s, and as you can see, these albums came quite quickly. Like first 3 albums within basically less than 2 years. Then another 2-year step to Latex Cult, another 2 for Rapture, another 2 years for Nihil. So they were pushing the gas pedal quickly. Only 1 year later, Absence of War, Dust and Peace, which in my opinion has a really beautiful cover. This is, by the way, one of my friends who is in this picture. I had to fact check it, but it's a really cool picture. It's so different and so fucking fitting. And this was like a year later after Nihil, and then you have 2 years after that, All That You Fear, another 3 years in Pro Patria Finlandia, where they're kind of like going back to the patriotic themes of Suomi-Finland Perkele, and then Manifest a year later, 3 years for Road of the Octagon, another 4 years for Vigorous and Liberating Death, and 7 years for Eight-Headed Serpent. This is the only gap where it feels like, what the hell happened to this band having the gap when we kind of used to that you would have album either every year or at least maximum of 2 years. Now, whatever you think about Impaled Nazarene style, because they have been provoking people, they have been giving middle fingers to all possible directions, and they have not been apologizing. They have annoyed people in religious, in various genders and various probably political directions. They don't really seem to give a fuck. Of course, everybody gives a fuck about something, but one thing I really have to respect in Impaled Nazarene, as obnoxious they can be, that they are probably one of the punkiest black metal bands in the whole world, because they were not apologizing. They were just like machine gun firing those middle fingers to every directions. If somebody got annoyed, the band would probably rejoice and not give a fuck once again. Get drunk, get wasted, do more tours, more gigs. They were getting cancels. They don't also give a fuck. They do something else. They change directions. But of course the band has been taking some safe steps ever since. But this is when you get older. I mean, it's kind of bound to happen and all. Meaning they were probably not as suddenly so punky after all, with some controversy and all, but always, most of all, still being quite brave what they do, or just outright silly, stupid and all that stuff. Maybe it's a combination of all, being brave and being stupid, being obnoxious and also not giving a fuck. Maybe it's laid back, or maybe they just have so much hatred they don't really give a fuck. But it's a quite interesting journey when you go throughout all these albums and see the different lineup changes. I will get back to one day for the whole retrospective with more focus on the covers, on the lyrics and all that stuff. Now this is just to summarize the whole idea, that while Impaled Nazarene changed their style with the given lineup changes, like Alex Laiho, rest in peace, from Children of Bottom taking part of the band, maybe that's when they had the more melodic death thing going on. But there always has been the, what you could call Impaled Nazarene hard pumping. It's black blood out there. So it's been annoying Christian people, annoying probably other religious people, and so many other things throughout the years. But they are also one of the very hateful and aggressive bands on stage, and I gotta say I like their presence. I'm not the biggest fan of their music necessarily. I mean, there are higher and lower points, but it never let me down. Much like Archgoat, who have made nothing but good albums, Impaled Nazarene never fail you. I guess I could say with Beherit, I'm not a big fan of the certain synthesizer albums, like the H418, but they changed their style too much, whereas Impaled Nazarene had always, much like Archgoat, kept the focus in the music. Archgoat is the most solid of these three, don't forget that. They have never strayed aside, like, and no sidestepping. Impaled Nazarene has been more like a little bit of a drunk driving, like, still keeping it in the road. Sometimes like, oh, this is more melodic, this is more punky, this is more motorheadic, this is this and that. But yeah, Impaled Nazarene is Impaled Nazarene, and with these more than 10 albums under the belt, you cannot do another Impaled Nazarene without being Impaled Nazarene. So it has been an interesting ride, and I'm still looking forward to hear their new music, see them live, and hopefully, as we talked with Mika earlier this year, hopefully do an interview for Rauta someday. He's an interesting character. I like him because he can be so goddamn aggressive and hateful and all that stuff, and also he can be like the laid back cool guy and all that stuff. I know that the band has had other members, but it's more like Mika being the spearheading guy, and the rest of the guys can a little bit be more in the background and not maybe get so much flack when people are, just annoyed with the band and all. Now, this is a lengthy video, I know, and I hope you managed all the way this far. These are very, very different kind of bands, and also already showcasing how different it was for Finland as well back in the early 90s, shaping up Finnish black metal. Later on, things started sounding more like typical Nordic, but that only happened years and years later with different bands. For next episode, I will be talking about some other bands which are maybe not so weird, not so pioneering and veteran as these three, but nonetheless important, maybe even bigger than some of the bands here. But maybe with these three bands, you could think about going full discography runs. It will be interesting. For Archgoat, it's simple, only a few albums and always the same style, not disappointing you one bit. If you like one, you're probably gonna like them all. With Impaled Nazarene, it's a little bit more bumpier ride, and with Beherit, it's gonna be weird. You're not gonna like all of the album most likely, but if you do, well, that's good news for you. Anyway, all the links are provided for this Metal Archive site, which you can then use for more related links like Facebook, Instagram, band pages, Bandcamps, whatever. And should you have any questions, I'll let you know. Oh, one weird anecdote. Since I have met people from the bands various years, once upon a time I was at a festival and I had this weird receipt from a bank note automatic, ATM. This was back in the days when cash was the king and not so much cards. And I had this weird receipt saying 660 marks, 88 cents. And it was just funny to see that 666 things. And I kept the receipt for many, many years in my wallet for just, I don't know why. Maybe because of the funny number. Because that was what I had, money left in my account. And then I noticed Mika Luttinen was watching a show. The same show I was watching at some festival, and it's like taking the note and asking like, hey, can you give me an autograph? Sharing my beer with him, and yeah, he gave it me. And years later, I met this more like a friend of a friend who was bigger Impaled Nazarene than me. I was like, I need to give this receipt to you, not because of the receipt, not the sum, but because of the autograph, because you like Impaled Nazarene even more than me. You deserve this autograph. I've never been an autograph follower, so maybe that autograph found a new home with the funny number and all. Yeah, not much of a bigger story than that, but had to share it. Now off we go, and looking forward to do a next episode, but prepare it to be big because I'm gonna include Horna among other bands, which means a lot of hours put into the listening experience. So it might take some time, but bear with me, and we'll talk about that band among others as well. Take care. Bye bye.